And good evening, everybody, and welcome to the April lecture meeting of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada Toronto Centre. I'm the President, Ralph Chu, and I'd like to welcome everybody who's online watching this from home. Tonight we have a guest speaker, and I'll introduce her very shortly. Today's been a very eventful day in the sense that of course, most of us have already looked at the stuff online on the first image of the event horizon of a black hole, and that's a very momentous occasion to see that image shown. And those of you who were in the room before the lecture stream started will have seen the feed from Florida with the impending Falcon Heavy launch that's supposed to happen tonight. So we'll see what happens with that one, but anyway, lots to do tonight. Is there anybody here for the first time at all? Well, welcome. Tonight's meeting is one of two types of meetings we hold here. We have a formal lecture this evening. Our next meeting will be a less formal session called a recreational astronomy night, and I'll excuse me, and I'll talk about that later on. Another thing about this week of interest is that it's National Volunteers Week, when organizations such as ours recognize the role of volunteers in our membership to help us to present our programs. And out of our over 800 members, there's about probably 70 to 100 people who dedicate a lot of time and effort towards helping us with our various events, the public outreach activities across the GTA and up at our observatory near Thornbury, and other volunteers who help with organizing things for both the David Dunlap Observatory and the EC Carr Astronomical Observatory. And as part of the celebration of National Volunteer Week, I just want to say that we appreciate all the help that you as volunteers contribute to our programs, and thank you very much for that support. And we hope that that will continue into the future. Okay, tonight we have Dr. Sarah Symons from McMaster University to speak to us. She's an associate professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Science, and she's also cross-appointed to the Departments of History and Physics and Astronomy. So she's really spread her self across quite a lot of academic disciplines at the university. Her bachelor degree in mathematics and astronomy, as well as her PhD in history of astronomy, were obtained at the University of Leicester. And since she arrived at McMaster, she has been active as a pedagogical designer and a teaching professor in the Honors Integrated Science program at McMaster. Her teaching interests include science literacy and scientific skills development in science courses big and small, while her research is in pedagogy of science education, active learning, and assessment design. She was awarded an MIIETL Impact Fellowship in 2015, and her skills in faculty development and managing curriculum change have been recognized by a visiting professorship at the University of Tokyo. Her research in history of astronomy concentrates on the astronomical texts and instruments from ancient Egypt, investigating how the sky was perceived and described up to 4,500 years ago. She spends her time excavating in museum basements around the world, looking at fragments of astronomical documents, then translating, categorizing, and publishing the results. She incorporates her interest in the role of astronomy in society in her outreach work with the William J. McCallion Planetarium at McMaster, where she serves as the director of the planetarium. So please welcome Dr. Symons, who is going to be talking about its Sirius o'clock, astronomical timekeeping in ancient Egypt.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for being here, or thank you for tuning in from home. Archaeologists and astronomers have a lot in common, really. We all spend our time peering back into the past, trying to work out what's happened, when, why, and how. So tonight, our subject is astronomical timekeeping. And first of all, we have to deconstruct our understanding of time. The ancient Egyptian language had two words for eternity, and these words represented two types of eternity: a linear progression of time and a cyclical progression. And throughout our discussion of timekeeping tonight, we're going to see that there are inherent problems in how we categorize the world. Something that we think may be a starting point and an alignment that we can use to base our discussion of time may turn out, in fact, not to fit nicely with our human wish to find patterns and schema in everything that we look for. And things that at one point synchronized, sometimes we find eventually actually are out of alignment when the cycle completes. And indeed, one of the main things we see in ancient societies, one of the main interests, is in calendrics. And we can break this down very, very simply from the point of view of noticing that the sun has a cyclical movement, the moon has a cyclical behavior, or a set of cyclical behaviors, and early calendars are a kind of attempt at meshing these. In the case of ancient Egypt, the solar calendar produced a description of the year that we're going to see a lot tonight, so it's worth introducing it here. This is the ancient Egyptian civil year. It consisted of 3 seasons: Akhet, Peret, and Shemu. Each season had exactly 4 months of exactly 30 days each. And therefore, that creates a year of 360 days, plus, you see the little red sliver at the top of the circle, 5 extra days upon the year to make a total of 365. So here we're talking about dividing time into units, and but we're not really interested in total about years. We're interested in other sorts of time units. So as we know, a year can be quite easily defined if we look at an astronomical body. Let's take the sun, we can find a solstice, we can measure a year. Similarly, the idea of a month comes very directly from observing a moon and its phases. For days, we can go back to the sun and look at the noon point. And we have a problem with the word day in English. It can mean two things. It can mean a 24-hour period, or it can mean a daylight period. So we have to think about how we measure night as well. Do we measure it from the point of sunset, and what exactly does that mean? Do we measure it from the end of twilight? And we have at least 3 definitions of twilight that we could use in that case. But these all are astronomically based. In longer time periods, thinking of things like eras, then we tend to base this on more political decisions. And this was the same in ancient Egypt, when the era would be described by the reign of the pharaoh, and the year was counted in regnal years of the reign of the pharaoh, which is rather topical with the start of the new era coming up next month in Japan. Again, a new era name, and a count starting from 1 will start then. Similarly, the unit of a week is an unnatural one. We make a decision. We have 7-day weeks. In ancient Egypt, though, a week was actually a 10-day period. And rather confusingly, Egyptologists have decided to call that a decade. So when I say decade, I mean a 10-day period, not a 10-year period. Now we're running out of natural phenomena. There's one rather obvious natural phenomenon that we could use to count smaller time. So if we go down to the realm of a second, human heartbeat would be a reasonable guess for a timekeeper for that short length of time. But in fact, in ancient Egypt and nearby civilizations, we find no evidence that that was in fact used as a short period of time. And indeed, we have no subdivisions other than fractions of the hour in ancient Egyptian texts. So we arrive at our point for the night, the way that we measure hours. And we're going to see that this is, again, not an obvious natural time unit. We have to make a decision about how we're going to divide up the day into some smaller portions. In ancient Egypt, we find three methods: sun, water, and stars. Let's begin our journey into the ancient Egyptian hour from a familiar perspective with some timekeeping methods that don't involve astronomical bodies. This is a model of a water clock, a fragment of a water clock, which is in a museum in Rome. It shows the shape of a vessel, and this type of water clock was used from about 1500 BC through to the end of the Pharaonic period, Greco-Roman times in Egypt. The most complete example of this you can see in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And it is a timekeeping device about this big. You fill it with water. There's a small spout and hole at the bottom. The water runs out gradually over time. And if we look at the interior of the vessel, it is covered with columns of dots, and the water level would fall past these dots and tell off 12 time periods. Now, the columns of dots are themselves labelled. There are 12 columns, and they're labelled with the months of that Egyptian civil year, the 12 months of that year. So if we pick particular columns, they're labelled with month names, and therefore we can use it to tell the time. And because of the way that the hour scales vary in length, we can tell that this type of device was used during the night. It divided the night hours into the night into 12 hours. What do they use during the day? Well, the obvious examples that we have that survive are sundials, of which we have four main types. Now, these sundials appear around 1500 BCE, around the same time that water clocks appear. We have very few of them, only two of this type of L-shaped example, around 8 to 10 of a slightly later sloping example, which caught the shadow on a sloping scale. We have about 8 very small semicircular portable sundials, and we have a lot more later concave, either conical or spherical, sundials of a type that wasn't invented in Egypt. This is a Greco-Roman type of sundial, which you can find spread all around the Mediterranean. From these, we also see that the daylight hours, the shadow-forming hours, were 12 in number. So what do we have here, looking at other types of timekeeping device? We have from at least 1500 BC and perhaps earlier, that time was measured in units that we would describe as hours, similar length to our hours. The hours that these objects told, though, were all seasonal. They varied in length throughout the year. They divided the daylight time into 12 segments. They divided the night into 12 segments. However, although you often see it said that ancient Egypt was the birthplace of the 24-hour day, it's not at all clear that this was a continuous 24 hours. That it was very definitely a group of 12 day hours, a group of 12 night hours. And we see these hours personified as gods and goddesses in two distinct groups of 12. We also find, if we examine these sundials and water clocks and try to work out what the nature of time that they told was, that the uniformity of interval does not seem to have been a priority, especially in the sundials. This is odd to us. We seem to like to have equal intervals of time, a definition of an hour that's very solid. But in ancient Egypt, this does not seem to have been the prime priority. So with this background in terms of what type of hours existed, the sorts of instruments that have survived to the present that we can interrogate that are more familiar to us, like sundials, like the idea of a fluid running out of a vessel, we must turn our attention to a more unfamiliar area, which is using the stars to denote periods of time. I'm going to introduce you to 3 types of object that are called star clocks. The two that are most secure in their name of star clock are the diagonal star clock or diagonal star table and the Ramsesside star clock. Now the Ramsesside star clock we see from about 1100 BC, which means that it was contemporary with our sundials and our water clocks. But there is an earlier type of star clock that we first see around 2100 to 2000 BC, the diagonal star clock or table. But we're going to start with the 3rd type of object, which is described as a star clock, which could be even earlier than the diagonal star tables. Now, this is a text, so it doesn't look like an instrument, it's not a clock in that sense. It's a text that seems to have been called in ancient Egyptian language the fundamentals of the course of the stars. And this is a whole book describing the sky, and in particular the motion of the stars related to the motion of the sun. It describes the year of the stars, the way they move, the way the sun moves, and it sets it all in the context of the religious myth, the story of how the sky works. This text, the most complete version of this text occurs in a very, very interesting building. This is the temple known as the Assyrian at Abydos in Egypt, and it was originally an underground temple. What you see now is that the temple, the floor is underwater, it's so deep down, the roof has collapsed, so it looks as though it's open to the air, but originally you would have entered it via the tunnel that you see on the bottom right, and here's a cutaway diagram of it, and you would have entered down the long tunnel, underground, made a turn, come into a transverse hall, and then into a pillared hall where you would have been standing on a kind of island with a watery moat around it. The text that we're interested in is in a further room where there was no doorway through to that room. It was completely sealed off. The text is carved into the ceiling, the sloped ceiling of that room. This is the one part of that text which has a picture of that text, the fundamentals of the course of the stars, and it shows the sky goddess Nut arching over the ground, being held up by the air, personified by her father, and under her body lists of dates. Under her body, along the sand line in a cycle, and along her body, the names of stars. Now this text, Fundamentals of the Course of the Stars, is a very important text in ancient Egyptian astronomy, perhaps arguably the most important text. And it contains a lot of information and a lot of complexity. It's also very long-lived. Although this temple was built in around 1300 BCE, the text itself survived through to papyri from the 1st century AD in commentary format. So it lasted a very long time, and it could already have been very old when it was carved on the ceiling of this temple. What does it tell us about our timekeeping stars? Well, the text contains within it a list of 36 stars, or perhaps small groups of stars, asterisms, and we give these particular stars the name decans. Decan comes from 10, and they're going to be stars of 10-day periods, but we use the name decans for them. Now, each decan in this list has dates associated with it for 3 activities that befall each star over the course of a year. So the dates are labelled in Egyptian Tepet, And then the next star will have a date for Tepet, which is 10 days after that, and the next star 10 days after that. So the stars are arranged at 10-day intervals. And the star that Tepets at one date will perform another action, Shenduat, 90 days after Tepet. And that means all the stars again do their Shenduat action 10 days after each other. And the third activity is labelled Mesut. And this always occurs exactly 70 days after a star has done the Shenduat. What on earth are these activities? Well, we learn from another part of the text that the model for these 36 stars is stated to be Sirius. And from this we can work out, and from the meaning of the word Mesut, birth is heliacal rise, the reappearance of a star after it has been invisible, i.e. not above the horizon during the night, after a period of 70 days. So that's our 70 days. Shenduat, enclosing the duat, enclosing the underworld, is the disappearance of the star at the beginning of that period of invisibility of 70 days. So this is a calendar of what stars do throughout the year, and it's not any stars, it's stars that rise and set, and it's a subset of stars that rise and set such that they perform these events at 10-day intervals. Where, you might be thinking, is the clock in all of this? How does it work? Because we're talking about dates rather than about times. This is tricky. That first event, Tepet, if we understand Tepet to mean a culminating action, and if we take this definition of culminating at sunset, or marking the first hour of the night, then conceivably this list of stars and dates could be a list of culminating timekeeping stars. And this is the proposal that has been put forward by Otto Neugebauer and Richard Parker in their work Ancient Egyptian Astronomical Texts that was written in the 1960s. But the text as it stands does not serve as a clock. It doesn't have that relationship with hours that makes it explicit that this was used at this point in Egyptian history as a clock. However, these stars are very important to us, and we're going to keep that idea of timekeeping stars in mind and see where else they occur. This is part of a coffin lid. It's the image that was used at the start of the talk. It's part of a very beautiful coffin that is in a museum in Tübingen in Germany. And it's on public display. You can go and see it. It's one of the highlights of their collection. Very, very beautifully done. What we're looking at here is part of the inside of the lid of the coffin, decorated with the names of stars, the pictures of celestial bodies on the inside of the coffin lid. This type of coffin, a rectangular coffin, is quite common in ancient Egypt, but just a few of this type of coffin have these astronomical tables on the inside of the lid. If we look at where these coffins come from, we find out that we don't have that many of them. We have up to 30 of them, which is not a very large corpus. But of those, the majority of them come from one area in Egypt, the necropolis of what is now modern Asyut in the middle of Egypt, and a few scattered from Upper Egypt. When were these coffins made? These are around the 2100 to around 2000 BCE. And we have one example from later, in 1200 BCE, and that is not in a coffin, it's in a building, it's in that same underground temple building. So this Osirian building is very important astronomically. Let's have a look at what's going on in these star tables. This is a picture of an entire coffin lid with star tables, and you can see that the whole of the available space is divided up into boxes, each box having the name of a star, the name of a decan. And again, that could be a single star or it could be a small group of stars. Each box here is nicely labelled with a little star symbol. And if you go to a museum and you're looking at a coffin and you see this big red dot on the left here, that is a very characteristic marking for this type of table. It doesn't seem to occur anywhere else but in a star table. So I always say, just on the off chance, if you see one of these in a museum and you can't see that I've got it on my research website, please do let me know, because we are still finding them not only in the ground but also in museum collections where maybe they haven't been catalogued. This type of presentation of the text looks very beautiful. The paint is nice, the writing is clear, but it doesn't actually preserve the full width of the table. And we have to look at ones that are maybe not so aesthetically pleasing in order to get the majority of the data out of these. And this is an example in the museum in Aswan, and this is a very cursively written example of a diagonal star table. Let us zoom in on a portion of that and see if we can work out what is going on. So in this portion, we notice, first of all, because we're in ancient Egypt, by default, we read from right to left. So we're starting at this end of the table, and we're looking for patterns. So we know that each square contains the name of a star or group of stars, a decan. And let's pick this one, this nice pair of catfish. And we notice that each decan moves diagonally across the table, step by step. Along we go. Some nice pairs of catfish moving up the table. So we can look at what the whole of one of these tables might look like. We can schematize this so that we can get to grips with what's going on without having to deal with the intricacies of language quite yet. So we notice the diagonal pattern across the majority of the table. We can replace each decan name with a number or a letter to make it easier for us to spot patterns. And we can note that our fish actually is decan number 10 in this schematic. That's the portion of the table that we were looking at in the photograph. But now in the whole table, we can see that it enters from the first column of the table. The names of the decan stars are well known. They're fairly easy to read. And here's an entire list from that type of table that we can see there. And there's our pair of fish, which has a pronunciation something like Khenwi. We don't really know how ancient Egyptian was pronounced accurately at this point in time. And indeed, the reading of this pair of fish is difficult anyway, but we'll call it Khenwi. And the first stars in this list inhabit the first column of the table. And the list continues across the table, adding one decan at the bottom of each column with one decan falling off the top of each column as we go through. And we find that the whole table contains not just the 36 stars that are running across the top, but also some extra stars, which we'll come back to later. Now, I must say that I am simplifying things a little bit here to not get into a morass of detail, linguistic, archaeological, etc. We actually have at least 2 different lists of stars that indicate that maybe there were different forms of this table, maybe they were made in different places, maybe they were made at different times, or maybe they were looking at different events that the stars were performing. But we'll just stick with our schematic version at the moment. The next thing we have to look at is along the top of the table is often a row of dates, and these dates are from our ancient Egyptian civil year that we've met already. How does the year map onto the table? Well, this is the far right-hand end of the table where it begins. There's our fish going up in position 10 throughout. Here's our civil year. If we look across the top row, we find that the first 3 cells are labelling the first month of the season Akhet, the first decade. Decade, 10-day period, it's the first 10 days of the first month of the year. Then we get the middle decade of the same month comes next, and the last decade, and then we move on to month 2 of the season of Akhet, beginning decade, middle decade, last decade, and so on through the 4 months of the season of Akhet. If we keep going further along the table, to the middle part of the table, we're in the season of Perrot, again with each month divided into the 10-day periods going across the top. And then for columns 25 through to 36, we're in the final season of Shemu. But there's something going on at the far left-hand end of the table. Here we have a label on just a few of them which explains what's going on in the last column. The label in Egyptian states 5 days upon the year. So these are those 5 days that are added after we've had 360 to make up the 365-day civil year. And that column is labelled to relate to that period of the year. We also see that our fish have returned in one of these 3 so far unlabelled columns. What's going on here? Well, what we think is happening here is that having divided up the table, we can see that the decans in the first decade, the first 10-day period in the season of Akhet, are our decans 1 to 12. The decans in the first decade of the season of Perrot are our next set of decans, 13 to 24, and so on for Shemu. And as we've just said, our 5 days upon the year, we have our special decans with letters. Those highlighted columns for Akhet, Perrot, and Shemu are these columns in the middle here. So these are our season columns. And this is actually, it looks fairly obvious, but it was actually my colleague, Dr. Robert Cockcroft from Weston, who pointed out that, in fact, these last 4 columns at the end of the table could be used as a kind of handy seasonal star table, all just by themselves. Well, we've got a pattern. We've got stars doing things. We've got lists of stars. What are these stars? Well, unfortunately, this is harder than it looks. We know what some of these stars are. Tentatively, but we agree that that stars 23, Chau means the thousands, it's Pleiades. The star labelled Chemes and Hentet, red one of the prow, probably, possibly Antares. And we're pretty confident that Sopdet, there's 2 groups of stars here, of the Tepiah Sopdet in front of Sopdet and Sopdet, are Sirius. And the stars in the region before Sirius are the stars of modern Orion. Unfortunately, we have no idea what our fish are. Various researchers are working on trying to agree what some of these stars would be, but it's not as easy as it may first appear to work out what is going on. But at least we've got Sirius, at least we've got stars in the region of Orion, and they don't just appear in the list of stars. In the middle of the table, we have some figures, astronomical figures, going back to the Tübingen example here. The sky goddess Nut, if you remember, she was the one that was running all across the top of the Fundamentals of the Course of Stars star list. She's there. And down here we have a figure representing Sahu, which was the Egyptian name for the region of Orion. Also, the god Osiris was associated with this constellation, and Sirius as a woman with a pointed triangle on her head. The 4th character is the foreleg called Meskhetiu, which is a group of stars of the northern sky, our Big Dipper or Plough, which, if you came to a previous talk I gave about astronomical ceilings, this was one of the group of northern stars that we see depicted in astronomical diagrams from ancient Egypt. That's about as much as we can say about which of these stars are. So we know that they're stars which rise and set. They're not circumpolar stars. We know that they're modelled on Sirius, so they have a period of invisibility. Maybe 70 days is the ideal. How closely that was adhered to, we do not know. And that they do something in order. And this is where we find that there is no manual attached to these diagonal star tables. There's no other contextual information about how they were created, or how they were used, or how we should make the observations that formed these tables. But we can make a conjecture, a reasonably good one, that we're looking at stars rising over the eastern horizon in order, and the 10-day intervals we're certain about because that's clearly labelled. So we have this idea of a diagonal star table, a table of annual star risings, stars rising one after the other as a kind of stream of stars over the eastern horizon. Can we get any further than that? Well, now we know that one of these stars is Sirius. Maybe we can look at the behaviour of Sirius and try to work out from there what is going on. So Sirius in this depiction is star 31 in our list, and there is Sirius marching across the table. Now, as we go from column to column and row to row, we know what the horizontal movement represents. We know that one step to the left of the table is a 10-day period. So the horizontal movement is time in decades. Moving upwards one step at a time indicates that Sirius is doing its activity earlier in the night. And this gives us a conceptual model of what is going on with this set of stars in the table. And I'm going to describe this using a very simplified model of the sky. We've got a green line representing the horizon. Anything that's below that green line, below the horizon, we can't see it. And if a star is above the green line, we can see it. We're looking due south at the meridian. And the stars are rotating. But the portion of their rotation that we're interested in is the portion that happens when it's dark. So this is represented by the arc here, and if we imagine this is Sirius, this is on a certain day of the year where Sirius appears at sunset, so we can't see it, it's below the horizon. During the course of that night, it will make its progress around, rise up above the horizon, and let's say that the day that we're looking at here is the one where Sirius just manages to get high enough above the horizon before sunrise that we actually see it at heliacal rise, and that's this day of the year. Now, if we advance time by 10 days, what's going to happen? The star moves on a little bit. It gets a bit higher up over the horizon. And let's say that is when hour 12, the lowest row of the last hour of the night, is measured by this star. So it gets all the way round to nearly sunrise. It marks the last hour of the night, and then the sun rises. 10 days later, its rising would mark the 11th hour of the night, and so on at 10-day intervals. Around we go throughout the year. Now, at some point, it's going to culminate just before sunrise. This is potentially what that Tepet event is from the fundamentals of the course of the stars. We continue around the year at 10-day intervals, and eventually the star falls off the top of the diagonal star table after it's marked the first hour of the night. And so on, around we go. Now, during the course of the year, the star will eventually disappear, and it will spend 10, 20, 30, 40, 70 days before it rises heliacally again, and then starts telling the hours. So this is our conceptual model. Very much simplified, doesn't change the length of the night in any way, but it just gives us an idea of what the star is doing through the course of the year, rising, telling the time, and then disappearing for 70 days and reappearing again. And this is where we get the notion of this type of table being a clock, that the movement across horizontally is time in days, decades, and the movement upwards is time in hours. And then we can label the rows of our table as hours 1 to 6 in the top half and 7 to 12 in the bottom half. But there's a problem with this model. In my very simplified model of the sky, I can click 36 times, the star will come back to where it was 360 days later. That's not very realistic. The year is not 360 days long, and the sky won't let us have it that way. And the ancient Egyptians, of course, completely knew this because their civil year already has 5 extra days in it, making it 365 days long. What effect does this have on our conceptual model of whether this table is an accurate description of the sky? Well, What we envisage, and again this is the concept of Neugebauer and Parker from the 1960s, is that our stars represent a stream of stars around the sky forming nearly a complete circle of 36. Nearly, but not quite. When we get to the first decade of the first month of Shemu, we have all our 36, the final 12 of our 36 stars. The next 10-day period, what we would expect to happen with a 360-day year exactly, will be that star 1 will be ready to take over and continue on in the table. But the year is not 360 days long, star 1 is not in exactly the right place, and what we see in the table is a different new star, completely different star, which we call A, added at the bottom of the table. And then 10 days later, we need a new star again, and we call that one B, and so on through the rest of the year, with these new stars being added in, one by one, that overlap interstitially between our stars 1 through to 12. The 5 days at the end of the year undoes that halfway shift, and at the beginning of the next year, stars 1 to 12 will serve in the first decade of that next year. We call the stars used in here triangle decans because they form a triangle at the end of the table, and they're very interesting because if they didn't exist, this would just be a very simple schematic, like my PowerPoint slide, a simple motion of the stars. But because they exist in the real tables, it means that somewhere in here this was observationally based. There is some understanding of what is going on here, otherwise we would not need these halfway decans to finish off the year. We would just say decan 1 is good enough, decan 2 is good enough. So what do we gather from these diagonal star tables? Well, dating as they do from at least 2100 BC, and again, perhaps earlier, we're always talking about what we have surviving here, and how long something, a text, an idea existed before we have a surviving object. That is a very difficult question. So from at least 2100 BC, perhaps earlier, we see that the motions of stars were recorded in this very schematic way. Each star moves perfectly. 1 square across, 1 square up, 10-day period by 10-day period by 10-day period. We see from the book Fundamentals of the Course of the Stars that Sirius was described as the template for these timekeeping stars, these decans. And we know that these stars were chosen to rise and to set from the Fundamentals book at intervals and as they made their progress across the sky. Now, later, those rows in the diagonal star table were clearly understood to be hours and were labelled as hours. How do we know that? Because the example in the temple, the underground temple at Osirian from much later on, has the diagonal star table but with the rows labelled explicitly with the word hours. Up until that point, we're conjecturing that these things could be related to hours. At that point, they definitely were. So these tables could have been used to tell the time. If you had one of these tables, or you could memorize the pattern in one of these tables, and you could recognize stars in the sky, you could go out at night, you could see which star was rising, and you would be able to say, well, that one's the 8th star in the column for today, it's the 8th hour of the night. But a table like this, painted on a coffin lid, is not in itself a clock, and personally, I think after looking at these for some time, it's much more likely that what we're seeing with these tables is a depiction of the movements of the stars. So the lid of the coffin was a depiction of the sky in the same way as an astronomical diagram in a temple ceiling was a depiction of the sky, a representation of the sky in the world of the temple. In this case, I think that these tables were depicting the motion of stars in the sky over the course of a year, as a procession, so doing things in time. And I think from that idea, eventually the idea of using these to mark the time probably emerged. So there's some nuances here about what we think about time, whether we think of time as being an abstract stream and we arrange events measured against that stream, that's what we do now, or whether time was defined by events, whether the stars rising defined the hours themselves, instead of having some kind of other stream of time and saying, oh, which stars are rising now? So there's some very, very interesting questions about why these were used, why they were made, and what they really are. Can we really use the word clock to describe them? Possibly, but I'm not too sure. The third type of text I'd like to show you today is called the Ramsesside star clock. And this is a text which again occurs in a funerary location. It's depicted in the ceiling decoration of 3 tombs in the Valley of the Kings. This is part of one of them. The text that we're looking at is the bit of the bottom here. We've got a row of people sitting down underneath a grid, and you'll have to take my word for it in this photograph because the text is so faint. This is filled with text, and the grid is populated by stars. In another area of the same ceiling, we see part of an astronomical diagram. In fact, here we see the northern circumpolar group with the hippo, a representation of the foreleg, and the other characters that make up a representation of the northern part of the sky. These people and their associated tables form part of the star clock itself, which actually consists of 24 of these tables. So each of the tables has the similar layout. It consists of a figure, a grid of stars, and an accompanying text. Sometimes the figure is actually depicted, shown within the grid, and sometimes below. That just seems to be to do with how much space was available to paint the star clocks. Now there are 24 of these tables, and each one relates not to a 10-day period of the civil year, but now to a 15-day period, a half-month period of the Egyptian civil year. And it seems that the extra 5 days in the year in this text were not accounted for at all. They're not mentioned. What's this grid and the text? Well, let's have a look at the text first. The text in each of the 24 tables is very regimented. It follows the same pattern from table to table. The first row contains the date of the table, so either the beginning of the month or the beginning of the half month, the second half of the month. Then it will give an hour location. The first one is the beginning of the night. In subsequent rows, it's the end of the subsequent hours. This gives us 13 rows in all, defining 12 time periods between these 13 points. The next part of the text gives the name of the star, and then the final part of the text gives a position which ideally relates to one of these 7 positions in the grid. I say ideally because this is, like all texts that are so old, is not a perfect text. They do not always match up. There are many, many copying errors and mistakes, and we can't tell which ones are significant. But the pattern seems to be that the star position should be described in the text and repeated with a figure of a star, so that a complete table looks something like this. And this really does look like data. It really does look very promising for working out what these stars are. Of course, we have to think that these are not coordinates in space. We can't look for these shapes that the stars make because we've got, yes, position going across here, but this axis is actually time through the night that we're looking at. So it's not quite a coordinate grid that we can really get to grips with. In terms of these positions, how are they expressed? The 7 positions are described in relation to parts of the upper human body. The one in the middle is described as straight ahead, and then we have 2 positions over the eyes, the ears, and the shoulders, making 7 possible positions for a star. Further complication about these is that the words for right and left in ancient Egyptian also mean east and west, and it's really not clear which way round we're supposed to be looking at this, whether we're talking about a cardinal orientation or a left or right of the target person that we're looking at. As far as the names of these stars go, these are not the decans. They're a different group of stars which we only see represented in these Ramesside star clocks. The complete list of them can be grouped in roughly into constellations: the constellation of the giant, constellation of the bird. We have got stars which relate to Sahu, Orion, and Sirius, Sopdet, in there. So we do have some reasonably fixed points that we can work on. We also have some difficulties in that some of these constellations at the end, the lion, the mooring post, and the hippo, are names that are associated with circumpolar stars of the northern sky. So how do we have a list of stars which includes both Sirius and the stars of Orion in the south, and also stars from the circumpolar group in the north? Neugebauer and Parker suggested that, in fact, there are two constellations, just like we have two lions, two bears, two dogs, that it's perfectly possible to have two hippos, certainly, two lions. Yeah, we're happy with that. Mooring post's a little bit more difficult. The constellation, the mooring post, is so clearly related to a fixed point in the sky, around which the sky can rotate, the North Celestial Pole. Having another set of mooring posts seems to be a little bit more tricky to argue for, so I'm not entirely convinced about this explanation. Here's the way, though, that the leading idea about how these Ramesside star clocks were created. You need two people, an observer and a target figure. It could be a statue for the target figure. It could be something else. I've even suggested in the past that you might be looking at a reflection of yourself in a shiny surface. You'll note that these people are depicted face on, which is very rare in Egyptian art. Very famously in ancient Egypt, the profile view was much more common than the full face view. So there's something interesting going on there. Anyway, your observer brings a piece of papyrus and starts with today's date, and then at the appointed time at the beginning of the night, either mentally constructs this idea of 7 locations or physically has a grid or some mechanism for distinguishing which of 7 positions a star might be in, and then waits for the beginning of the night, looks at the first star, records its name and its position. And then it's a case of waiting an hour, end of the first hour, star B, end of the second hour, star C, and so on throughout the night, writing down the names of stars and the positions. At some point, we can imagine that the observer had some choices to make. Which was the better star? We can analyze statistically the data that we have and can very clearly see that the central position was favored. But sometimes maybe a famous or desirable star would be in a different position and that star would be named. We do not know the thinking that went on in the choice of the stars. We also do not know what these 7 positions really represent. We immediately begin to think of lines of equal azimuth. We think, how tall would this person have to be? Are you on an eye line? Where are you sitting relative to one another? How far away are you? All of these questions, again, we do not have an instruction manual that came with these texts. So it's very difficult to unpick. You start with what looks like a pile of observational data, rich for discussion and analysis, and find out that you have to make a lot of assumptions before you can begin to address that data. So what can we gather from these Ramesside star clocks? Well, first of all, it appears that we actually only have one source, in that although these Ramesside star clocks appear in 3 tombs, and in fact one tomb has 2 versions of it, so we've got 4 of them in total, they are all very clearly from the same source. They have the same errors in them, and they agree more often than not. So these tombs are in a very, very condensed period of time, right at the end of the 20th dynasty, which is right at the end of kings being buried in the Valley of the Kings. So these occur in some of the very last tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And this was a dynasty of kings, all of whom took the name Ramesses, and their reigns roughly got progressively shorter as the country destabilized and went into an intermediate period. If one of them had reigned long enough to make a bigger full tomb, we'd have a lot more information about this. But unfortunately, we just have these 4 sources that in fact collapse down to a single source. However, this table, unlike the very schematic set of diagonal star tables, is very clearly based on real observations. The stars do not move regularly from table to table, from hour to hour, in a pattern way that suggests that somebody was calculating where would the stars appear. It very much does seem to be somebody's notes, perhaps from a single season of observing, with all of the variation, the choice of stars, some stars only occurring once, maybe there were faint ones, very definitely observationally based. It's interesting that 15-day intervals were used instead of 10-day intervals. The half month was marked in ancient Egypt, so that's not a surprise, but why the change was made from 15 to 10 is perhaps not so immediately clear. Why were decans not suitable for this job? Well, we see that decans were probably more to do with rising and setting, but we also had that Tepet event, which Neugebauer and Parker conjectured meant culmination. If, as Neugebauer and Parker suggest, these stars were also culminating, so our pair of observers were aligned north-south, so that's the central position is the meridian, then why were not the existing stars which fulfilled those characteristics, why were they not used? But we do see that the night is still divided into 12 periods. Here, the points between those periods are marked, the beginning of the night, the end of the first hour, the end of the second hour, etc. And in these tables, these are very explicitly denoted as hours. The Egyptian word for hours is used here throughout these tables. This could really have been a clock. If you couldn't memorize this is far too difficult, unlike the diagonal table with its patterns, this is too difficult to memorize. But if you had a copy of this on papyrus, you could use it for telling the time if you could guarantee that your method of observation matched up with the method of observation that was used for creating the text in the first place. And that, having described these 3 methods, brings us to the more discursive questions of, well, these things that may or may not have been used as clocks, but all of which definitely did use stars, and all of which definitely did introduce the idea of calendrical motion and recording observations of stars. What are they for? Who made them? How were they used? And why do we find them in such, to us, odd places? Why do we have to look inside a coffin to find an astronomical text, or a tomb, or an underground temple in an inaccessible room that there isn't even a doorway into? And if we could grab a time machine and go back and speak to this man, he's described as an hour watcher in the temple of Amun at Karnak. He would be somebody that I would very much like to speak to, because he might be able to describe what's going on. First of all, again, what we have is what has survived. So we only see the things that were made carefully enough, clearly enough, placed in places that are undisturbed enough, made out of materials that are durable enough to have survived. We do not see what would have existed in its totality. Even things like the sundials, the little sloping ones particularly, have a weak point, so the gnomons break off very, very easily. They seem to have been common because we have relatively quite a lot of them, but the ones that we do have are made in slightly more precious materials. The ones that are just made of plain wood or a less durable maybe a clay rather than something precious like ivory may not have been taken good care of. So we only have the things that have survived. All of these things are copies of other things. I don't think anybody has suggested that these are the original Ramesside star clock. There must have been a papyrus copy and probably several generations of papyrus copy. The Fundamentals of the Course of the Stars text gives us an example of what's going on here. We see it used in a temple ceiling, in a building that was very deliberately depicting an archaic time. This underground temple represented the tomb of Osiris, and its decoration seems to have been chosen specifically to hark back to a very early time period of semi-mythical history in ancient Egypt. So this text may have been brought out to be used in this context, but it would have existed in a temple library. And part of the rest of this text seems very clearly to be a manual that would have been used to educate priests, for example, to give lists of star names, to give a description of how to use a sundial. It was a type of text that would be called a sort of instructional manual for priests. That is where this knowledge would have existed. How it came out of the temple libraries and began to appear in temples, that one's easy. Tombs of royalty with the Ramesside star clocks, perhaps understandable. But coffins of people who are not royal is a little bit harder to imagine. We do think that Asyut is a very interesting place. Asyut in around 2000 BCE seems to have had a fashion for using astronomical material in tombs. We see the diagonal star tables on coffins. We see astronomical diagrams being used in tomb ceilings. And in fact, when I say we have copies of tombs with that decoration, copies on papyrus from much later that tell us those tombs existed in Asyut at this time. That's a rather complicated chain of evidence, but it seems likely that Asyut was a place where the funerary architectural style, when you chose your coffin, you chose your tomb decoration, that astronomical content was on the menu that you could, if you liked, choose to include in your coffins. And we see that out of the many hundreds of coffins in the Asyut necropolis, just a small fraction have these star tables. But still, they're much more common in Asyut than they are in other places in Egypt. But why would you want a depiction of the sky actually inside your coffin with you? If you opened your eyes, this would be just near your head that you'd be able to see. Perhaps there are some clues here in the behaviour of the stars themselves. Remember that these Deccan stars are described as disappearing, like Sirius, for 70 days, and then being reborn. The Fundamentals of the Course of the Stars describe this cycle of rising and setting daily, but then doing this longer set for 70 days and being purified in those 70 days, and then being reborn at the heliacal rise, Mesut, again. The period between death and burial in ancient Egypt traditionally was also 70 days. So a star in some ways mimicked this life cycle of a person who died, spent 70 days being prepared, purified, mummified, tomb getting ready, all of the goods being put in there, and then on being buried could then be reborn into the afterlife. It seems possible that this notion of becoming a star that started way back in the earliest religious texts we have from ancient Egypt, in the pyramid texts, the idea of the pharaoh becoming a star, in his case one of the northern immortal stars, may have trickled down through to people in the nobility, people who could afford this type of coffin, and that they may have had an idea of becoming a star as well in the afterlife. This table could have been a manual for how to behave as a star, how to navigate the sky. In that case, that does not seem to require timekeeping in the for living people, that the dead person would behave in the manner of a star and follow the time in the sky is fine, but why would living people need to know the time? Well, we know they did because we started off looking at sundials and water clocks. And we noted that sundials, of course, are used during the day, but water clocks are inscribed in such a way that they were used during the night. So here we have evidence that telling the time during the night was important. But who was it important to? The water clocks that we have are big stone vessels. They're not the sort of things that ordinary people would have had in their homes. They belonged, apparently, to temples. And I think it's there that we have to look to find out what was going on with timekeeping and who needed to keep time. The figures in the Ramsesside star clock tables are dressed in such a way that they could potentially be priestly figures. They have beards, and the idea of two priests going to tell the time is an attractive notion. They could maybe climb up to the roof of the temple. This was one of the ideas put forward about these, that the temple roof would be the place for observing, and they would have access to their papyrus star clock because it came from the temple library. They could climb up, tell the time throughout the night, and come back down again during the day. Why would they need to do that? Again, we are in the realms of conjecture here, but the idea of following the time during the night in order to know what was going on with the sun during the hours of darkness is a reasonable idea. One of the ways that the ritual of the temple needed to be timed in some way, and the hours of the night passing as they did one after another would help inform the activities in the temple and maybe prepare for activities that happened around dawn. What did ordinary people know of all of this? It's very hard to say. Would people have known how to tell the time using the stars? Would they have had a knowledge of these star names? Were these star names common throughout the country? These are all questions that unfortunately are being lost because they're part, presumably, of the oral tradition of people of the country and didn't get written down in the same way as maybe this more ritualized, more formalized idea of timekeeping. I find this work very interesting to look at texts and tables and try to work out not just what people were looking at, but how they made these observations is a very interesting peek into the minds of people who were performing acts that we recognize as observational astronomy, to record motions of stars, to observe what patterns happened, to observe when patterns broke down and we need to add different stars because the ones we wanted to use don't work out. These are some of the oldest astronomical texts in the world. They still have a lot more to tell us, and they are still coming out of the ground today. So at any moment, there could be a new discovery in this area that would tell us more about the ancient Egyptian sky. If you would like to know more about the ancient Egyptian sky, I do have a website where you can look at all of the diagonal star tables, look at the stars, the decans, and see how they move across tables and what we know about them, which I do encourage you to visit. But thank you very much for your attention.
Hi. My question is for the Ramessian star tables. Like, obviously, they're getting stars that are not necessarily culminating. They're here and there. But how would they have known that that's the hour? Because it seems to be a chicken and egg problem.
Yes. The idea is that perhaps a water clock was used to time periods. Now, the water clocks we have are big ones that have the hours of the night for the whole night marked off. What we don't have, but what we can conjecture may have existed, are smaller ones that tell a particular length of time, that you can just fill them up, and when they're empty, that's one time period. So that would be one way that you can do that. However, going back to my comments about sundials, that the hour length seem to be very, very variable. Again, we can't be certain that hour length was the important thing in the Ramesside star tables, that absolute rigidity or standardization of hour length was the important aspect of those.
Dr. Symons, you've explained, I was curious as to why there were 24 hours in a day. You've explained that, okay, 12 in the daytime, 12. Did they, and they only seem to be concerned about hours. Smaller divisions, 60 minutes, 60 seconds, that's a later concept?
There are fractions of hours mentioned. And in fact, there are some texts which measure the length of the night throughout the year, which use fractions of hours, which suggest that there was a standard hour, because in order to say the night is getting longer and shorter, you have to have a standard hour by which to measure it by. So, but there's no unit of time shorter than an hour that is known. It's just fractions of an hour.
So minutes and seconds came much later.
Yeah.
Okay. The North Star precesses. Does that have any influence on the star rising and setting?
There are a couple of effects that we have to take into account with these. First of all, we talked about the difference between the year being 360 days long, 365 days long. We didn't talk about the extra quarter day and the idea of a leap year, which didn't happen in this period of pharaonic history in ancient Egypt. And also the notion that, so that this diagonal star table would have gone out of date within 40 years, because you've got 40 quarter days, would mean that everything was one space out. Now, on top of that, precession would have meant that eventually even your 36 stars, instead of just being able to shift them along and keep it in date, there would be some strange wiggles going on. The trouble is that these star clocks didn't last long enough in continuous use for us to see that effect. So the ones that we have from Asyut are from a very localized time, and the one much later appearance in the Assyrian probably harks back to that time rather than being a complete re-implementation. And then the Ramesside ones, we only have this short window that opens, they're in these 3 tombs, and then they're gone. We never see them again, we never see those stars again. So we can't tell what effect precession would have had if this kept moving. There's some tantalizing hints in this body of objects. There's a lot more going on than I've been able to describe here. I've simplified it to saying there's 36 plus A to L. In fact, we have these 2 traditions and subgroups in those traditions, and you can see that some Deccan names are common to the different traditions and some are not. But rather interestingly, the gaps between the stars, if you've got 2 stars that are in the 2 traditions, they're not the same distance apart from one another. And this is a problem, because stars do not move against one another invisible. You know, we're talking about naked eye astronomy here. The distance between them should not change. So what are we looking at? Maybe a different event. Maybe one tradition was based on rising and one on setting. That would cause the stars to move against one another in this way. Maybe a change in latitude, so one tradition from further south in the country, further north in the country. Maybe changes over, for a long time, precession might have had some impact on that as the sky gradually twisted. There's some interesting things going on in there. In the later, yes, yeah.
Okay.
I just think that if it was my job to study the sky, I might hang out in a dark, enclosed space all day, and maybe that would make sense to have a star map on the roof. And maybe when I was ready to be buried, they'd put that same chart on my coffin lid so I could enjoy it in the afterlife.
Maybe we are looking at an astronomical society of Asyut.
You know, your model clearly shows 365 days a year, 3 major segments, 4 in each one, 12 effective months. That little filler of 5 days or 5 nights, looking at today's calendars, what part of the year would that normally have fallen in on? Would that like continuing like our December or June or?
It would be as if we decided that we can't remember 30, 31, what are we going to do? We're going to take all the 31 days, we're going to put them at the end of December.
No, but I'm trying to decide that 5-day window. Would that have happened our days July?
Oh.
And their November?
Well, because it's a 365-day year, it slips against our Gregorian year. So,
Still dealing with a small window.
yep.
Huge time.
Yes. So that 5-day period has occurred all the way through our year because it just keeps slipping continuously. 1400 years cycle, 1461 years cycle. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. Appreciate it. Sorry. Going back to the previous gentleman, I liked what he was thinking. I was thinking, it's too bad we only find these things like on a coffin lid, because you can imagine them being in a Times Square or something like that. You know what I mean? And everybody telling time of day, like going about their business throughout the day, like as a community. And you also touched on it at the end where they were kind of hidden, and perhaps it could have been for nobility or people that could afford it, or the fashion in that area. So, like, if that is indeed the case, this must have been on public display. Like, if people knew about this and were doing it and were actually using it in a funeral ceremony, it must have been part of their life, not just part of their death. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I was just kind of thinking about this whole thing, like how it just is a picture of a coffin and not part of life, you know?
Well, that's the part that we don't know. So, for example, although we have literature from ancient Egypt, we don't find hours mentioned in literature. We don't find that imprint in other areas of life that we would expect. And some of it could just be that we don't notice it. I mean, what is a water clock but a pot with a small hole in it, a pot with a leak? How would we recognize a simple water clock from in a pile of broken pots? It may be too mundane for anybody to mention, too mundane to be labeled as such, too common knowledge to have been written down. Interestingly, though, the only modern equivalent of these star clocks that I've come across is through the work of a researcher called Harriet Nash from, I think, Exeter in the UK, who has looked at water resources in Oman. And up until quite recently, the way that water was shared amongst farmers was determined by each village would have a man who changed the water over to the next farmer based on the motion of stars through the night and sun during the day. So it's water share. So each village would have this tradition, and of course it's being lost. It's mostly been lost, but it's being lost right now. We're just at the end of that being within the oral tradition, and she has been trying to collect examples and identifications of stars. And the scary thing for me from her work is that she finds that people used the edge of a particular building or a particular tree as the marker for where the stars go. Now, if we think back to trying to work out what do the diagonal star tables show, are they rising over the horizon? The Ramsesside star clocks, is it opposite a person we think, oh, north-south? It could have been against the wall of a particular building or one particular statue. We have no idea what that point of reference might be, and we have no way of reconstructing it.
Any other questions?
Sorry, one more. The only people that would really be interested in time are the people in the temples, maybe some government officials. The slaves, you know, they go to sleep, they wake up. They're not really interested in time. In the daytime, you know, the sun's overhead, okay, lunchtime. Goes down, we go to bed. It comes up, we get up. So it's more an upper level aristocracy consideration.
You would think, but there is some evidence that the idea, ancient Egypt was very, very administrative in its structure, and there's some very recent evidence from the Valley of the Kings itself, where a few years ago a semicircular sundial was found in the Valley of the Kings, painted on a small piece of rock about this big. And the idea, why would people out working in the heat of the valley need to be able to tell the time in this way? And also the supplies for people who were working in the valley included groups of wicks, which could also be used to time. You know, you burn a wick and it measures time. And it seems that working shifts may really have been timed that closely, and that it was that important for fair share of work that would have driven timekeeping. And there's some other tantalizing evidence for this. In the L-shaped sundials, as I showed you, they're quite small, they're only about this big. And they're sundials because we have a text describing how to use an L-shaped sundial with marks along the top. But they're also identical, apart from the marks along the top, with a kind of surveying instrument, which is basically a handle for a plumb bob. And you may have seen these in museums because they seem to be part of many collections, that you have a handle and then a string with a plumb bob attached to it, and that you could use, there's a little line on the upright bit that you could use for finding level. It's exactly the same shape with the plumb bob as those sundials. And it is possible that the person that was using the plumb bob noticed that the shadow on the plumb bob throughout the day that you're out there working, surveying your site, indicated the passing of the time and started making marks on it when arriving at work, when it was time for lunch, when it was time to go home. And that may, and this is hugely conjectural, but it is a path of development for that type of sundial. And again, comes from a very mundane act of timekeeping among somebody who was, in that case, would have been skilled, but not necessarily, well, definitely not a noble in that case. So we just can't say. It would be lovely to know how much of this actually went on in everyday life.
This is not necessarily a question. It's just that Paul Delaney sends his regards and says hi from Australia.
Hi, Paul.
The calendar goes 365 days. I'm curious to know how the Egyptians knew that a year was 365 days, even though that's not the right number. Did they find the solstice by when the shadow is shortest or longest, or did they somehow work out when the equinox is? Do you have any knowledge of that, or is it still lost in the sands of time to be discovered by more work like what you do?
The origin of the calendar is a very interesting, hotly debated question. For a start, the civil calendar is a solar calendar. There's also a lunar calendar with lunar months, and the two ran alongside one another in some sense throughout history, and the month names got transferred one between the other. The calendars seem to have been set up by the time writing began, so we don't have a point of origin. We sort of assume that there was a 1 Akhet 1 original first day of the year at some point, maybe coincident with some point in the lunar calendar that year, and it was set running. And very famously, one of the assumptions in the whole of ancient Egyptian chronology of working out when pharaohs reigned, because they used regnal years, not a continuous year count, very famously, it absolutely relies on the assumption that once the civil calendar had started running, 1 Akhet 1, followed by 1 Akhet 2, followed by blah, 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 all the way through 365 days, start again, that was never interrupted for any reason during the pharaonic period of history. If it was interrupted in a let's change from Julian to Gregorian, give us back our 11 days sense, there is a big impact on the chronology of ancient Egypt as we understand it. So the notion of what came first, yes, you can measure natural phenomena, yes, you can take averages, but which do you prioritize? Do you prioritize physical occurrences like the Nile flood? Do you prioritize the sun? Do you prioritize the moon? When do you start a period? These are all up for debate.
Fascinating. Can you talk a little bit more about the two figures and the orientation, left, right, east, west? How was that known, please?
So we're talking about the Ramsesside star clocks and this idea of the positions. The text tells us Yabi or Wenemi in the text accompanying. So here the star position is written. And so we can relate it to the star in the grid. And as I said, although there are some errors, generally these two things line up. So we can see that for sure the Wenemi stars are the ones that occur in the what we would call left positions on the grid. And the Yabi stars are the ones which we would call the right-hand positions on the grid. But the words that are used, and these are the symbols, the hieroglyphs for Wenemi, is also the symbol that's used for the word Imeni, which means west. And this symbol for left is also used for, in this case it's pronounced the same, Yabi, for east. And what we can't tell is which was intended. Was it intended to be the star over the right eye? Or was it intended to be the star over the west eye? And clearly it's not over the right as I look at it, because it's the wrong way round. So it must be the person's or the statue's left-hand eye. Or is the statue oriented in a certain way so that that's the eastern eye? Again, no manuals, no instructions. So we're pretty clear about we can, this is the constant struggle. We can translate it, but we can't interpret it.
Other questions?
You talked about mirror image.
Can you
wait for the microphone? Sorry. You talked about mirror image with that too? Like, wait for a microphone? Yes, sir. Thanks. You did mention kind of like a mirror image, like looking at something, looking at yourself, perhaps. Was that part of the culture at all or anything? Like,
Well, there's a couple of things. We do have mirrors, ancient Egyptian mirrors. They were made of bronze, polished. I'm not sure how good they were. We also have the notion of stars being watery, the sky being watery. The stars are depicted as floating about on little boats. The stars are sometimes described as fish swimming in the water. So we have this notion of stars being connected with water. However, the idea of reflecting stars in water was just something that I was thinking about with this problem of this face. Why do we show this person full face? Whenever we see statues depicted, they're always shown in profile. Very famously, people are shown in profile in ancient Egypt. Yes, we do get full face depictions, but they are very, very rare. So why here? And why was this depiction of this person so important that it was repeated 24 times with no variation in pose throughout the 24 tables of the year? And even when there wasn't room for it, this figure would be put in amongst the stars. The stars would be displaced around the figure in order to make room for it. It seems very particular, the way the figure is dressed, the way it's included. The other problem that we have are the stars that are included. We have Sirius, we have Orion in the south, and then we have these possibly the northern stars. How do we see all those stars? If you're just looking in one place in the sky, watching stars go past someone's head, you don't see Sirius and the North Celestial Pole going past that person's head. So having to move around or look in different parts of the sky to get these observations would be one way of explaining that. Of course, it's much easier to say, oh, it's just 3 constellations with the same name in a different part of the sky.
One final observation. It's pretty clear that the Egyptians were very much into astronomy and conscious of how the sun moved. If you look at the pyramids, they're oriented east, west, north, south, the sides. The 3 pyramids at Giza are reminiscent of the belt stars of Sirius. And I know that the temple of Abu Simbel, the one that was moved when the Aswan Dam came up, they had to be very careful to position it properly because I think at some particular point, the light from the rising sun went down a 125-foot corridor and just lit up Osiris, or put Osiris in the dark. So they're very, this determined how they built temples. So yes, they're very conscious.
Yes, and through classical history, they had the reputation. All of this knowledge from ancient Egypt was a theme of classical writers as well, that Egypt was the place that held all this knowledge. So it's tantalizing to think how much there would have been if we could only find one intact temple library. When they were talking about the possibility of an extra room in Tutankhamun's tomb, I think people were thinking of gold and treasures, or maybe another mummy that explained family relationships, and I was just thinking, please, let it be text. And indeed, the Library of Alexandria, the loss is still felt, yes.
Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, I think from the number of questions that you got, that my prediction was right, that you would get challenged by our audience tonight. Thank you very much for a very fascinating talk, and it's a good thing they didn't think of daylight savings time. So, as a small token of our appreciation, a couple of little things here for you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Looking at upcoming events and so on. So I'll remind you that our next meeting is in 2 weeks' time, and that'll be the Recreational Astronomy Night. Program is Brian Charnock will be presenting the Mother's Day edition of The Sky This Month, followed by Elizabeth Tasker on alien landscapes. And I understand that the Science Center shop is arranging for some of Ms. Tasker's books to be brought in for a book signing, so that should be interesting. And then Richard Blackman will be talking about fiddling with focus, so should be an interesting evening. Fiddling with focus, yeah. Okay, our next speakers night is on May the 8th. We don't have a speaker confirmed yet for that, but hopefully we'll have that in time for the next meeting. Solar observing got washed out last Saturday, so we're going to try again this coming Saturday from 10 until noon out on the telescape. And Sean, in his usual way, will let us know whether it's a go or no go, either on Friday evening or first thing Saturday morning. There was a successful dark sky star party, City Star party, wasn't it, the other night? So Adrian made the right call after all, which was great. And just a reminder that our next dark sky star party is the first clear night of the week of April 29th through the 2nd of May. And the following week we'll have the City Star party for May first clear night of the 6th through the 9th at Bayview Village Park. Millennium Square is starting up again. The March night was canceled because of ice on the waterfront. Hopefully that isn't the case this weekend. All we'll have to contend with is the possibility of clouds and rain. But if it goes ahead, that will be on Friday, starting about 6 p.m. and ending at 11. We've been told that Rogers TV will be out there with a small crew to film the proceedings if the weather is good. So be on your best behavior, please. And let's show the viewers in Durham what a Millennium Square night is like. And remember that the go, no-go will be in the usual way, and the backup date for this event is the next evening, Saturday night. We still have International Astronomy Week coming up, and again, Sean is going to be organizing that for us here at the Science Center. And International Astronomy Day is Saturday, May 11th. Again, we should have a program here in addition to having a booth down at Science Rendezvous at the University of Toronto campus. I'm not sure if there's going to be another event at the DDO, but certainly with the Science Center location as well as Science Rendezvous, that probably will keep us quite busy that day. A reminder also that you have the availability of the Carr Astronomical Observatory near Thornbury, and we still have the winter protocol in effect. Although it's been warm and most of the snow and ice has disappeared from the GTA up near Georgian Bay, it's still sort of winter. Ian Wheelband was up at the CAO last week, and he reported back that the road still had about a meter of snow in some spots where it's low-lying. So while most of the roads up there are clear, you get up onto our road, and if you drive into that first hollow north of the houses along our approach road, you may be there for a few weeks. So be warned. We are using the winter protocol until at least the beginning of May. Again, you can book online through the website to go up there to the CAO. We have two of our three telescope loan program managers here tonight, Mark and Peter. George made a quick exit a little while ago, but if you're interested in borrowing any of our equipment to try it out before you buy, these are the gentlemen to talk to. And finally, meeting after the meeting, the usual spot at the Granite Brew Pub, and again, you're welcome to join us there. Okay, so that's it for the announcements. We have a few leftover calendars here. If anybody wants them, you're welcome to take them along, because it's so late now in the year, there's no point in selling them. So please help yourselves. There's a few of them left here. We'd prefer them on your wall rather than in recycling bins. Okay, so thanks again for coming out tonight, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.